This week, the agenda visited the world inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway, searched for a scientific citizen, and pondered the province's poverty plans. The agenda's Week in Review begins with, it's a bird, it's a plane, no, it's a drone. Did I read right? Have you sold drones to the Halton Regional Police?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
What are they using them for?
Traffic accident reconstruction is probably one of the biggest uses, but search and rescue, tactical scenarios, there's really a ton of applications. And we have our product actually in use with the OPP, and they've taken traffic accident reconstruction from an hour and a half is sort of the typical time down to about 10 to 15 minutes. So the 401 is opened that much faster.
And Steve, if I could add, the OPP, very respectful of privacy. They've talked to us about, my former office, about the drones. They really want to ensure that the privacy is embedded into the system and used for authorized purposes like the ones you mentioned.
Can I push back on that a bit?
Yes.
OPP using drones to monitor protests in eastern Ontario on the Tyonendaga First Nation.
They didn't mention that to us.
That's, you don't say. I mean, would you say that's not kosher?
As I said, I wasn't aware of that. But the point is that, so maybe you do need, at the very least, a very strong policy. We don't have the laws yet, but you see, OPP, law enforcement is very good at following laws, so maybe you have to engage this in regulation for purposes like that.
There have been airborne law enforcement regulations and guidelines for years. Ever since airplanes were invented, law enforcement has been conducted by aircraft in one form or another, right? So the rules around what's admissible, when you need a warrant, what you can do from the air, that's sort of a well-established.
But they should have a warrant for purposes like this, and that should extend to that.
I think Ann also brings up a really interesting point around how the drone communicates to anyone who sees it. In that drones are already using wireless communication to operate, right? There has to be a connection between the operator and the drone itself. So why couldn't you have, for example, a regulation that says drones must communicate, say via Wi-Fi, to anyone within range as to its purpose? So it says, I'm here to scan roofs, or I'm here to check crops, or I'm here to reconstruct traffic. So that just like a website has to have a privacy policy that you can go and read what's saying, perhaps drones should be wirelessly communicating to anyone in range exactly what their purpose is. So that if it didn't, you could report it. And you could say there was suspicious activity in my neighborhood, the drone was not communicating what was going on. And you could answer whether the industry would do that on its own, but that's an example of a regulation that would be easy to comply with.
So as an example, that's not that far off from what's happening in aviation guidelines through access to airspace. If I'm a pilot, my concern is running into a drone. I mean, we've heard of stories this operating outside JFK Airport. So in my case, I'm another pilot operating in the area. I want to know what drones are in my region, what altitude are they operating at, so I can avoid them. That's not that different from what you're proposing on the privacy side.
Yeah. You're the guy here with the Drone Journalist Association. Do you think there's any justification for the police using drones to sort of monitor protests?
I think there could be there could be a lot of justification. Perhaps it's safer than sending the police up in a full-size helicopter. Perhaps it's a lot cheaper. Those are two very good justifications, in my opinion, because right now they can do that. I mean, really, what the question to ask is, would there be a difference from a jet ranger flying around with a policeman hanging out the side to a drone? I mean, it's certainly a lot cheaper and it's costing the taxpayer a lot less money.
And a lot less intrusive and threatening, perhaps, as well.
There's that, too. I don't know. I mean, you can put a jet ranger up at 2,000 feet and with a Westcam on the side, you'll be able to pick out people's, the color of their eyes. Drones, are just different versions of a technology that's a camera that's airborne.
But then you've got to be transparent about it.
Right.
You have to let people know what's happening and not try to conceal this.
I think the challenge is exactly maybe what we're talking about, is understanding who's operating that drone. Because, as an operator, you could be, a kilometer away. You might not know who's operating it. And I think maybe the fear is, well, I don't know who is, and what are they doing? It's a valid question that we have to sort of address. But again, the technology probably isn't quite there yet. And as we move towards these kind of questions, drone makers and drone technologists will come up with solutions.
I think there's a different context, though, in the case of protests, in that here in Canada, we tend to think of drones as commercial or civilian. But drones have a military history to them. Yes. And amongst activists, there is a perception of the military use of drones. So I would almost imagine that if you were at a protest and you saw a drone in the sky, it would increase tensions. It would evoke the militarization of police.
You think that drone was there to shoot you.
Or you would just feel that its surveillance alone was intimidating, because certainly the idea of police surveilling protesters is a very contentious political issue. So while I agree, if you can clear the 400 or the 401 in great time, that's an excellent use of drones. But I think there needs to be an open association and acknowledgement that many people perceive drones as military hardware, not so much civilian or commercial.
Dave knows, hang on, I've got to get to Dave on this. You've got some experience on this.
Yeah, I mean, we sell our products to military, to police, and to civilian users.
Talk to us about Libya, though.
Yeah, so, actually through the Canadian government, we were connected to the acting Libyan embassy or envoy to Canada, and had our system deployed with the Libyan rebels. And in this particular case, again, they couldn't afford full-sized systems. And again, we don't arm our systems. It's purely a reconnaissance tool. But, we're able to train users across the language barrier and kind of deploy in the next day or two.
And what did they use your drones for in Libya?
Literally just looking on the other side of the hill to see who's over there. So sort of on the self-defense side.
They did not arm them. Should there be, Ian, a requirement to have some kind of specific license to operate a drone in the same way if you want to operate a car, you have to have a driver's license?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, then there is regulation, and I think the regulation is still very misunderstood by a lot of people. Right now, if you're in a commercial operation of a drone, UAV, Transport Canada has UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle.
Okay.
Transport Canada has a set of regulations of which you have to follow. You have to submit an application for every flight. It's a task to do, and those exist right now. However, for the hobbyist market, Transport Canada really backed off and said, we don't want to regulate the hobbyist market. There is the Model Aeronautical Association of Canada, who are people who have guidelines for people who operate model aircraft and have for decades. So there are rules in place. They do feel like they're kind of yesterday's rules for today's problems. And Transport is trying to address this. They're coming up with new regulations, and licensing will be part of that.
I see Anne shaking her head here.
I don't disagree with you at all, Ian, but those rules are still, in terms of aviation-related issues, I don't think they extend, not yet, to the surveillance, the potential for massive surveillance.
But I don't think Transport Canada wants to be part of that. That's not what they do. They're aviation
I don't care
people.
who does it, but it's got to be addressed.
That's fair enough. But at this point, there is no Transport really aren't privacy experts. They're aviation experts, and their main goal is safety. Safe operation of something that flies, whether it's 2 inches off the ground or 200 feet or 2,000 feet. They want to know.
But with due respect, they can work with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, Federal Commissioner. They have wonderful staff there who could assist them in developing that. The fear is, and people always say, well, that's so far off, that's never going to happen. The notion of a surveillance state, that is what threatens our freedom, free and open societies, which means even though obviously when you go out in public, it's different from your home. We all get that. But people still don't have a notion that just because I'm in public, the possibility of me being tracked is perfectly acceptable. We have to have an open debate on this, and I think we have to have some rules associated with this. I don't think we want to become a surveillance state, and the threat of that is looming. We have to address it.
Here's some of the bullet points on Ontario's poverty reduction strategy, this one going from this year to the year 2019. It recommits Ontario to its 2008 target to reduce child poverty by 25%. It will establish long-term goals to end homelessness. That's right, a long-term goal to end homelessness. It will index the minimum wage and boost support for training and employment programs, and it will continue social assistance reforms and use evidence-based policy with measurable outcomes. These are just some of the general thoughts behind the program, but I do want to get your sense on this latest version of what the government hopes will erase poverty, and let's get some feedback. What's your thought?
Well, it's good to see that there's still a commitment and that it is on the radar, at least, that there is some sense of the importance of addressing the issues of poverty. I'm concerned, especially within our work on homelessness, about the actual commitment when we're not still seeing a true or affordable housing strategy, and which is key to when within Niagara region, we have over 10,000 people waiting for affordable housing, and that's key to ending homelessness. I'm concerned about the fact that we're still not really talking about, again, from a YWCA perspective and women's issues, a child care strategy, which is important for women who are trying to re-enter the workforce, and a discussion around living wage. When we want to talk about employment, employment's important, but we also need to talk about what kind of employment that is. We have lots of women and families coming through our shelter system that are working full time.
Okay, Laura?
Well, I'm going to be a little nice about this. I actually like the language that they finally come around with, that acknowledging the government has a responsibility in these areas. Coming from CWP, Canada Without Poverty, we're really interested in the human rights perspective, and that everyone has a basic level of deservingness of shelter and food and a right to employment that pays an adequate standard of living.
Yvonne?
Well, actually, from a volunteer perspective, Freedom 90 is a union of volunteers that work in emergency food programs and food banks and meal programs. I think the thing that we could give credit for is the broad-based prevention framework, which I think is important. This does involve a lot of different ministries and a lot of different initiatives. But at the end of the day, prevention doesn't necessarily help those who've already been sidelined by poverty for the last 20 to 30 years in this province. So those folks who are the most marginalized, large numbers of them who we see in increasing numbers at the food banks, won't live to see the consequences of prevention initiatives that we'll see the impacts over the years. What we need is something now. I think we've been saying for a while that we need urgent attention to social assistance rates, which are still 50 to 60% below the poverty line in this province. And also, as mentioned earlier by Elizabeth, a living wage. A minimum wage is an important marker for what we think people deserve in terms of quality of life, and it's unfair to say that because we're indexing it that we're keeping up with the cost of living, because we haven't even started close to a wage that does reflect the cost of living. If it was 14 and indexed to inflation, we'd be talking a different story. So volunteers have a unique perspective on this because we work at the front lines and we see what's happening. It's not getting better, and people aren't getting any younger, and that's why they want to retire before they're 90.
Stephen?
Well, I was very happy to see the Ontario government come forward with, as part of their plan, a plan to end homelessness. Because homelessness, I think, is what one would call a fusion policy issue. It isn't just about housing, it's about health, it's education, child and family. It's every aspect of government. And in Canada, strangely, Ontario is only the second province to even go down that road of saying, homelessness is our responsibility, we're going to do something about it. So that's a big positive, that the language is good there. Now, they've left a lot of things to be determined, so there's not the investment or the actual plan to come, but we'll see how that goes in a couple of years.
Devil's always in the details, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the good news is we kind of know what to do. And it does involve more affordable housing. It involves more strategic approach to dealing with homelessness. We know what to do. So if we can hold them to account to actually putting in place a real plan with concrete outcomes, which is the language that they're using, then we may make some progress here.
John?
Well, I think it's very ambitious. I counted, I believe, 31 different initiatives in the poverty reduction plan. And using language such as eliminating homeless really is very, very brave. And I believe having Deb Matthews as the poverty reduction minister at the same time as she's also the head of the Treasury Board, a very interesting combination, because what you have in this instance is you have somebody who's dedicated to the idea that if you actually reduce poverty, you're actually going to have economic savings. And if we really believe that these investments will work, and I know in many cases, certainly homelessness, the cost-benefit analysis just knocks it out of the park in each case. So there's an instance where you could actually have real investments and actually realize savings over the long haul.
You could, though, Stephen, interpret that a different way, which is to say it will take investments, upfront investments, to end poverty in Ontario. And the person who's in charge of that is also the person whose job it is to make sure that the ministries under her purview don't spend too much. How do you do both at the same time?
Well, you do have to invest in it, and the savings will come later. And John's absolutely right. The the evidence is absolutely clear on what will happen if you house people who are homeless. The At Home Chez Soi project in Canada, its largest Housing First research project done anywhere in the world, showed that if you take that person who's been homeless for years, that hardcore, chronically homeless person with mental health and addictions issues, and you house them, for every $10 you invest, you save $21 because they're using hospital less, they're involved with the police less, their well-being is improved. So
But
so
not
we
right
have to
away. 5 years down the road, maybe 10 years down the road.
Well,
see, that's the trouble. They got to get to the next election.
no, there will be a requirement for an investment, and there's going to have to be new investment in other areas anyway. If you want to prevent homelessness, we have to increase the supply of affordable housing, right? And that's going to require direct investments. Governments in Canada have relied on market measures to expand the housing supply, and that's expanded the private housing market. It hasn't expanded the private rental market, and it certainly hasn't done anything about social housing. So there will be an investment required.
Yvonne?
Well, and let's not forget this isn't happening in a vacuum. I mean, there's reasons why we have chronically homeless people today.
Yes.
And so a prevention strategy, again, has always been the best one. It was the best one in the 80s. It was the best one in the 90s. But along the way, people have lost ground, right? They've been marginalized to the point where they're not going to be able to take advantage of that great new training program. So I think we have to take the blinders off and realize that at the end of the day, there are people that we're going to have to immediately help now, and we're going to have to help them significantly. And the longer it takes us to actually act on this, the more people are going to fall into that trap, because it doesn't take 2 years to be homeless before you have a trajectory that's pretty negative. So,
But Elizabeth, let me ask you this. This is not the first poverty reduction plan that this Liberal government has come out with. They did one several years ago. Now, they didn't count on the Great Recession coming along and derailing all of those plans, but the fact is they didn't meet any of the targets in that last effort. So how seriously do you take this effort?
Well, I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that they've reintroduced some of the funding that was cut, with the community startup and maintenance benefits. So to see that does show at some level there is some commitment. But I've been working in social services for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of ups and downs. And so, yeah, it's kind of hard to see. And I mean, as what Stephen said, you've got to be prepared to invest up front, and that's not always a popular way to do things in politics.
I'm going to do a thoroughly unscientific survey at the table here. You took science in post-secondary, right?
Right up to getting my PhD in it.
And you did.
Yes, I have a MSc,
And you did.
PhD.
Grad, yeah.
There's no way you did.
I did not.
Of course not.
I'm
You're
the
like
outlier here.
Well, no, and me too.
I studied English and law.
You're like every journalist in the country
There you go.
who doesn't cover science as a beat. You took no science in post-secondary, right?
That's correct.
Like all the rest of us. And yet, somehow, Canada managed to get to number one. I want to raise, let me raise a couple of the numbers here. You're in good company here. Don't worry, Tasha. Yeah. Let's put these up, because this is from the John Miller survey that he was just talking about. This is public attitudes towards science and technology. How do you think we fare in Canada? We got an average of 7.3 out of 10 in terms of the public views about the promise of science. That's 9th out of 17 countries. That's around the middle. But how about public reservations about science? We're actually well down the list, meaning we're very trusting. Only 3 out of 10 have public reservations about science. So we in Canada feel pretty good about science. We don't have, we're not mistrustful of it. And Penny, let me start with you on this. What do those numbers suggest to you about the health of Canada's science culture?
Well, I think when I look at science literacy and I see that only 43% can answer basic questions about science, that's pretty low. There's a long way to go. And I think also that while education is super important, that lifelong learning is really important in understanding science. And so if you look at the role of the media and how we can talk about science and inform the public, not only, I mean, when I did my degree, it was almost my science degree, it was almost the Rutherford model of the atom, where it's electrons circling like planets around the sun. And now, of course, it's all layered like that. And if we're not keeping up with the media by presenting science in an accessible way, we're doing a real disservice to the country, I think.
I was going to get into this later, but since we're on it right now, I mean, we joked a second ago about the fact that most people who cover stuff in this country for newspapers, radio, and television didn't take any science in post-secondary. I'm sure that's true. Are we doing a disservice to our readers, listeners, and viewers because of that?
Well, I think it's always easier as a journalist if you have a background. And there are different beats. There are journalists who, for example, would have, in my case, would have a legal background. I've done some legal journalism. People who would have had some science would have an advantage, in fact, in going into journalism in that area. But I think one of the difficulties as a journalist is when you are interviewing a subject, talking to a subject who is a scientist. Scientists are notoriously difficult to interview because not only is there that gap, as you describe, of knowledge, but sometimes they explain things in a way that even someone with some scientific knowledge might not understand. So they think there's an importance in terms of science also and its public relations, and the importance of scientists having media training and having the kind of abilities to translate their information in a way that public can understand.
How much of that 42% number, Larry, is based in what Tasha just said, namely, you people don't speak English when you talk to reporters who write stories?
Well, I'm not a scientist, but I have a science background. You know, I don't know if I'm answering this question correctly, but I think that the problem is that as far as I'm concerned, I'm an educator. The school system is not designed to actually educate most students.
The public school system?
Public school
is
system is not designed
to educate students.
Most students in science. It's designed to select out the ones who will become scientists and engineers, I believe.
As opposed to giving a general grounding to everybody.
Yeah, I mean the priority, most teachers, the system, if I could elaborate, but I think it's oriented towards those who would become students in universities and maybe colleges to some extent, but mostly universities. Most teachers are university educated. That's their orientation. That's the way they imagine their students achieving success, is going on to university. I hate to generalize. I mean, not all teachers are like this, but I could go on in length of this, but really the system is intending, I call it a sort of an unnatural selection process of selecting a training camp for future scientists and engineers, and the rest, in a sense, to add to that, I hate to elaborate, but I think the rest are set up as consumers.
Well, let me try this. Let me follow up on that with Katie then, and don't take this the wrong way, but you look like you're the most recent high school graduate of the group here today, or were most recently in high school, if I can put it that way.
Yes, probably.
Did it feel to you as if the education system that you came out of was designed to basically separate students into those who've got a shot at potentially taking post-secondary education science classes, and the rest we're not really going to worry about, which I think is what Larry's saying?
Yeah, I did my high school in Nova Scotia, where I don't think it's quite as bad there, but I've certainly heard from a lot of people I know in Ontario that students are streamed off very early on into sort of, you have the potential to do science and math, so you're going in this stream, and you don't, so you're not. Which I think is problematic. One of the stats from the report that is really interesting is we actually have quite low numbers of people who are doing their bachelor in science and math. So, maybe that's one of the reasons why. But that also means that we have less people in all these other professions who have a science background, because only about 20% or so of the population is getting degrees, undergrad degrees in science.
You think it has more to do with streaming or more to do with the way science is taught in the elementary and high schools?
Yeah, it's a good question. I definitely think both in the way we teach science and also in how we measure science literacy, I think we really have to be really clear about what we're talking about. I feel like often the focus is on sort of the product of science, so memorizing facts and outcomes of science, rather than a focus on the process of science. How did we get to those facts? The critical thinking, the scientific method. I think those are more useful. It's more important that we have a public that knows how to think critically and weigh evidence, rather than a public that can regurgitate basic science facts. And I also think if we started teaching it with more of an emphasis on the how to think like a scientist, I think that's also more interesting, and people would have a better time with it.
Streaming or the way it's taught?
Well, both. I agree with
Both
what
together.
she's saying. Yeah. rather than treating science education as a place to isolate, identify and educate those few who will become scientists and engineers who essentially will produce the knowledge for the knowledge economy. We need to, train those people, certainly, but we need to educate the masses to understand so-called the nature of science. So, as you say, the processes of science. But a major aspect of this really is how science is linked into societies and environments and politics and economics and sociology and all kinds of outside factors.
Tasha, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I do, because I think it's very interesting what you said about the critical thinking component, because more and more today the media consumer gets their knowledge on their own. The internet has changed the way people obtain information, so when they're out there looking at the masses of information available, if you don't have a critical thinking ability, you won't be able to distinguish between good science and junk science, and there's a lot of junk, especially on the internet, on various issues. Probably the biggest issue of recent note is vaccines and the information around vaccines in children. And there was a lot of misinformation that people accepted as fact because they liked the spokesperson for it.
I get all my information about vaccines from Jenny McCarthy.
I was going to say, and this is the problem, is that to counter that, if people have more critical thinking skills, if that was encouraged, they might look beyond the face of the issue to the actual science behind it.
Do the people who are a part of that life, though, do they, in your view, understand that they are leading lives that are unlike 99.99% of Americans?
I think they know it, certainly. I suppose they understand it. I think what people are not self-aware enough about here, first of all, is the appearance of it. I mean, we're going to have the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is this annual extravaganza that celebrates all of the achievements of the Washington media and the Washington political class. And it's not just one dinner. It goes over 5 days, and it's a couple dozen parties. And it costs tens of millions of dollars to put on, the various news organizations pitching in. And, I mean, what are we celebrating exactly? I mean, this is, again, a city that is held in very low esteem by voters across the country. The major institutions, whether it's the press or the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or Congress, what have you, are really being reviled. And I don't quite know why people feel that they can just go on celebrating and it's on national TV and what the message is here. So I think we really ought to reconsider a lot of the behaviors and a lot of the ethic that has sort of grown up in Washington when, really we forget that this is a city that supposedly was built on public service.
Even Tom Brokaw has said he can't go to it anymore. He thinks it's gotten too gross, right?
He said, if you go, it will steal your soul.
You don't go, I take it.
Well, the New York Times, we started not going in 2007, so I can sit here and be holier than thou and say that, no, I would never attend such a thing, even though, full disclosure, I did attend before the boycott went into place.
And it was fun, I bet, wasn't it?
It was interesting. I think after the first couple, it got a little old, and I think if you're a journalist, you can get a lot of work done. There's a lot of very, very important newsmakers and people, of serious influence who are all in the same room, and you can set up appointments and stuff. But no, I mean, ultimately, it's there's a soul-crushing sameness to it, and it's pretty surreal. And maybe part of the surrealness is that the way a lot of people handle it is just to drink a lot, and that was sort of my MO when I used to go. But it's look, I mean, it's not. I don't judge people for going. I just think that it's something that should be, frankly, discontinued. Mark,
one of the issues you look into is who owns Washington nowadays. And I think one of the most staggering statistics I read in the book was that in 1974, 4% of former politicians went into lobbying. Now, 50% of senators and 42% of congressmen go into lobbying once their careers are over. Why such a significant change from back in the day?
Well, I mean, there are a few things going on. I mean, first of all, Washington has become sort of a permanent feudal class. I mean, the notion that you come to Washington, you serve the nation, and then you go home to your farm or your medical practice or your shop or what have you, is very quaint. I mean, what we have here, especially over the last 3 decades, is a city that has been completely given over to moneyed interest. I mean, this is the wealthiest metropolitan area in the United States now. It's home to 7 of the top the wealthiest 10 counties in the United States, and people stay. I mean, no one goes home anymore. And when you're in office, it is very, very easy to make a fairly high 7-figure salary as soon as you leave office. So the money is available to senators now that wasn't 30, 40 years ago. And so I think that's one of the big reasons. But also I think, look, I mean, more people are paying attention to influencing Washington. I mean, corporations far more so now than they did 40 years ago. Even the media now, and I think new media is a part of this too, because there's a greater focus on the goings on here. But I mean, Washington has become essentially a very business town and a place that, again, people come to get rich.
Let's do a couple of examples here. Chris Dodd, his father was a senator. He was a senator. He swore when he left the Senate he would not go into lobbying. What happened to Chris Dodd?
Well, you can guess how this story ends. I mean, Chris Dodd, longtime, pretty liberal Democratic senator from Connecticut, promised a number of people, including me, in 2010 he would never lobby. Then he got out of Congress, got out of the Senate, and lo and behold, the Motion Pictures Association of America, which is one of the most powerful lobby, it represents the entertainment industry in Hollywood, offered him, I guess what's now $3 million a year. That was his annual salary last year. So lo and behold, he's a lobbyist. I mean, look, he's allowed to change his mind. He's allowed to make a living, and I'm allowed as a journalist to be cynical about it. But that goes on all the time. I mean, again, I don't know what he was thinking then versus now, but I mean, that's a fairly routine two-step that we have to deal with here, and that happens all the time.
And have you seen him since he took the job?
I have. Let's see. I've seen him since he's taken the job. I don't think I've seen him since the book came out. I don't know what his response would be, but yeah, no. Look, I mean, it's all pretty transparent. I think. I mean, we know what he's making, and I think he made a choice, and I guess more power to him.
Well, here's another guy, Dick Gephardt. Dick Gephardt was always for the little guy when he was in Congress. He represented one of those great middle American constituencies. And here's you in your book, This Town, saying he supported a House resolution condemning the Armenian genocide of 1915, only to oppose the resolution as a lobbyist who was being paid about $70,000 a month by the Turkish government, according to the Washington Post. Genocide goes down a little easier at those rates. What happened to Dick Gephardt?
Well, I mean, basically what you just said illustrates it perfectly. I mean, that happened on a number of events. I mean, a number of occasions. I mean, when he ran for president twice in 1988 and again in 2004, some of the most impassioned labor rallies I've ever attended as a political reporter were for him. And there was this great Teamsters rally I remember in 2004 in Iowa that he was at. And he was the son of a milkman. He was a Teamster. I mean, he really talked the talk. And I think he just made a decision that as soon as he got out of politics, he was going to change course and basically just sell himself to the highest bidder, whether they were helping the labor movement or helping the little guy or helping Armenia or what have you. I mean, that's sort of, I mean, I guess I have a grudging appreciation, if not respect, for Dick Gephardt's willingness to be pretty bald about it. I mean, he doesn't try to couch it in any great self-righteous explanation, but still, it's demoralizing to watch.
But that's the thing I'm really trying to get a better handle on. How does somebody who is one way and has one set of views for all of his political life, and then the second his career is over, he goes into lobbying and basically reverses himself on some pretty significant points of departure. How does a guy like that look at himself in the mirror the day after?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, look, I'm not in a position to know. I haven't talked to Dick Gephardt. I mean, I'm sure he would have a justification for it. He would say that he served however many years in Congress. He made a government salary. Of course, it's like higher than probably 95% of all Americans make. But no, I don't know how you live with yourself. I mean, I guess my only thought is that when you're in office, what you think about is getting reelected. And when you get out of office, what you think about is getting paid for it. And, somewhere in all that is your principles if you had them. But again, one of the really, really upsetting things about seeing this happen over and over and over again is it makes you cynical, and it's not fun to be cynical. And when you're a reporter in Washington, you become cynical because you're talked to in a certain way, and that's part of the process. But yeah, I mean, it does. I think lately we've had a lot more instances of it hitting you over the head, and again, part of this book was cataloging that.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org. on our iTunes channel and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.